It was a quiet afternoon, and I was home alone. My parents were at work, and my sister was at a friend's house. I decided to clean up my room and organize some old toys that had been gathering dust. As I was sorting through a box of toys, I found an old porcelain doll that had belonged to my grandmother. It had been passed down to me, but I had always found it a bit creepy. The doll had a porcelain face, glassy blue eyes, and a frilly dress. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I placed the doll on my shelf and continued cleaning. A few hours later, I heard a soft thud. I turned around and saw the doll lying on the floor. I picked it up and put it back on the shelf, assuming that it had just fallen. But a few minutes later, the doll was on the floor again. This time, I felt a chill run down my spine. I placed the doll back on the shelf and made sure it was secure. I went back to my cleaning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I was finishing up, I heard a soft giggle. I froze, my heart pounding. I looked around, but there was no one else in the room. The giggling came again, this time louder. I turned towards the shelf, and my blood ran cold. The doll's head had turned, and it was now facing me. Its glassy eyes seemed to be staring right at me. I felt a surge of fear and backed away, my hands trembling. "Mom?" I called out, hoping she had come home early. But there was no answer. I grabbed my phone and called my mom, trying to keep my voice steady. She told me to stay calm and that she would be home soon. I hung up and decided to wait in the living room, away from the doll. As I was leaving my room, I heard the giggle again, followed by a soft whisper. "Play with me." I ran out of the room and slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I waited in the living room, too scared to move. When my mom finally came home, I told her what had happened. She tried to reassure me, saying it was just my imagination. But I knew what I had seen and heard. We decided to put the doll in the attic, hoping that would be the end of it. But strange things continued to happen. I would hear the giggle and the whisper at night, and sometimes I would find the doll in different places, even though we had locked it away. I eventually convinced my mom to get rid of the doll. We donated it to a local thrift store, hoping it would find a new home, but the fear never really went away. Even now, I still get chills whenever I see a porcelain doll, remembering the glassy eyes and the eerie giggle that haunted me. I was home alone, my parents were out of town, and my siblings were staying at a friend's house. I decided to make the most of the quiet and read a book in my room. I was lying on my bed, wrapped in a blanket, when I felt a sudden drop in temperature. It was like someone had opened a window, but I was sure everything was closed. I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place. I shrugged it off and went back to my book, but the cold spot persisted. It seemed to be moving around the room like a cold draft that had a mind of its own. I got up and checked the windows and the thermostat, but everything was as it should be. As I was about to sit back down, I heard a soft whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding. I looked around, but there was no one in the room. The cold spot seemed to settle near the corner by my closet. I slowly approached, my breath visible in the icy air. "Is someone there?" I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. The cold spot grew colder, and the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me!" I backed away, my hands trembling. I grabbed my phone and called my mom, trying to keep my voice steady. She tried to reassure me, saying it was just my imagination and the cold weather. But I knew what I had felt and heard. The cold spot and the whisper were real. I spent the rest of the evening downstairs, too scared to go back to my room. That night, I slept on the couch, but the cold spot seemed to follow me. I woke up in the middle of the night, shivering, and saw a faint mist hovering above me. The whisper came again, clear and desperate. "Help me?" I bolted up and turned on all the lights, my heart racing. The mist disappeared, and the temperature returned to normal. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, too scared to close my eyes. The next morning, I did some research and found out that our house had been built on the site of an old farmhouse that had burned down years ago. A young girl had died in the fire, and her body was never found. I realized that the cold spot and the whisper must have been her spirit trapped and seeking help. I felt a mix of fear and sadness, knowing that she was still there, lost and alone. To this day, I still feel the cold spot every now and then, and I hear the faint whisper, begging for help. I try to reassure myself that she's just a lost soul, but the fear never really goes away. One rainy evening, my parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me in charge of the house. I decided to spend the evening reading a book in the living room, the sound of the rain creating a soothing background. I was engrossed in my book when I heard a knock at the door. It was unusual for someone to come by so late, especially in this weather. I got up and walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. A man stood there, drenched from the rain. He was wearing a long coat and a hat, which obscured his face. I felt a pang of unease, but decided to see what he wanted. I opened the door slightly, keeping the chain latch on. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound confident. The man looked up, his eyes hidden in the shadows of his hat. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "My car broke down, and I need to use your phone." I glanced around, but there was no car in sight. My unease grew stronger. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in," I said firmly. "There's a gas station down the road. You can use their phone." The man's expression didn't change. "Please, it's just a quick call. I won't take long." I shook my head. "No, I'm sorry. I can't help you." The man stared at me for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't focus on my book. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see the man staring back at me. A few minutes later, I heard another knock at the door. This time, it was more insistent. I hesitated, then walked back to the door and looked through the peephole. The man was back, and he looked angry. "Please, I just need to use your phone," he said, his voice more demanding this time. I felt a surge of fear. "I told you I can't help you. Go away," I shouted, my voice trembling. The man pounded on the door, making it rattle on its hinges. "Let me in," he shouted. I backed away, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation. They assured me they would send someone over right away. I waited in the living room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The knocking continued, growing more frantic. I could hear the man's muffled shouts through the door. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car through the window. The knocking stopped, and I heard the sound of footsteps running away. The police arrived and searched the area but found no sign of the man. They stayed with me until my parents returned, assuring me that the man was probably just a desperate traveler, but I knew there was something off about him. His insistence, his anger, it didn't feel right. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he had more sinister intentions. I still get nervous whenever there's a knock at the door, especially when I'm home alone. I was by myself at home on a warm summer night. My parents had gone out for the evening, and I had the house to myself. I decided to watch some TV to pass the time and escape the heat. As I was flipping through channels, I heard a noise coming from above. It sounded like footsteps in the attic. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon that had found its way in. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. My heart started to race as I turned off the TV and listened carefully. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking around in the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic hatch in the hallway. The ladder was already pulled down, which was strange because I was sure it had been closed earlier. I hesitated for a moment, then started to climb up. The attic was dark and stuffy, filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. I shone the flashlight around, trying to see if there was anyone up there. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence was deafening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the small space. There was no answer, but I felt a cold draft, even though there were no windows in the attic. I walked further in, my flashlight beam dancing across the dusty floor. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. Leave. I spun around, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I backed towards the ladder. The whisper came again, louder this time. Leave now. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled down the ladder and slammed the attic hatch shut. I ran to my room and locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I called my parents, but they were too far away to come home immediately. They told me to stay put and that they would check the attic when they got back. I spent the rest of the night in my room, listening for any more sounds. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When my parents finally returned, they checked the attic but found nothing. The ladder was closed and there were no signs of anyone having been up there. They tried to reassure me, saying it was just my imagination, or maybe a small animal, but I knew what I had heard. The footsteps and the whisper were real. From that night on, I couldn't sleep without my door locked and a light on. The attic became a place of fear and mystery, and I never ventured up there alone again. It was a lazy Sunday morning, and I was home alone. My family had gone to visit relatives, but I had stayed behind to catch up on some much-needed rest. I decided to take a long, relaxing bath to start the day. I filled the tub with hot water and added some lavender-scented bath salts. The steam filled the bathroom, creating a warm, soothing atmosphere. I sank into the water, letting the heat relax my muscles. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The mirror on the wall above the sink was fogged up, but there was a clear spot, like someone had wiped it with their hand. I dismissed it as a trick of the steam and closed my eyes, trying to relax. A few minutes later, I heard a soft tapping sound. I opened my eyes and looked around, but the bathroom was empty. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the mirror. I sat up and peered through the steam. The clear spot on the mirror had grown larger, and I could see a faint outline of a face. My heart started to race as I stared at the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The face in the mirror became clearer, and I realized it was not my reflection. It was a pale, ghostly face with hollow eyes staring back at me. I gasped and splashed water on my face, hoping to wake up from what had to be a nightmare. But the face was still there, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I climbed out of the tub and wrapped myself in a towel. I slowly approached the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The face in the mirror didn't move, but I heard a soft whisper in response. "Help me!" I stumbled backwards, my hands trembling. The face faded away, leaving the mirror fogged up again. I grabbed my phone and called my mom, trying to keep my voice steady. She tried to reassure me, saying it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had seen. I spent the rest of the day in the living room, too scared to go back into the bathroom. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face in the mirror. I kept the lights on and the door open, listening for any sounds. The next morning, I finally gathered the courage to go back into the bathroom. The mirror was clear, and there was no sign of the face. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the steam and my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it was real. To this day, I can't look into a mirror without feeling a sense of unease, wondering if I'll see that ghostly face staring back at me, begging for help. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and I was home alone. My parents were running errands, and my brother was at soccer practice. I decided to use the time to catch up on some homework and maybe watch a movie. I was sitting at the kitchen table, working on an essay, when I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like someone was moving things around. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, or the old pipes making noise. but the noise continued, growing louder and more persistent. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the basement door. As I reached the door, I noticed that it was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open and shone the flashlight down the stairs. The basement was dark and musty, and the only light came from the small windows near the ceiling. I slowly descended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise had stopped, but I could feel a sense of unease hanging in the air. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The old rocking chair in the corner was moving, rocking back and forth slowly. There was no one in the chair, and no draft that could have caused it to move. I stood frozen, unable to take my eyes off the chair. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking. When I finally managed to turn it on, I saw a shadow move across the room. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but I could hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming towards me. I backed up against the wall, shining the flashlight wildly around the room. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Get out." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted up the stairs and threw myself against the basement door, trying to open it. It was stuck, as if something was holding it shut from the other side. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. Just as I was about to give up, the door flew open, and I stumbled into the kitchen. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart racing. I called my parents, my voice shaking as I told them what had happened. They rushed home and checked the basement, but there was nothing there. The rocking chair was still, and the basement was empty. They tried to convince me it was just my imagination, but I knew better. I never went down to the basement alone again. Even now, years later, I can't help but feel a chill whenever I pass that door, remembering the whispers and the rocking chair that moved on its own. It was a cold winter evening, and I was home alone. My parents were at a holiday party, and my siblings were staying over at a friend's house. The house felt eerily quiet, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I decided to make myself some hot chocolate and watch TV to pass the time. As I was stirring the milk on the stove, I heard a soft thud coming from the hallway. I paused, listening intently. The house was old, and it often made strange noises, but this sounded different. I turned off the stove and walked towards the hallway. The light was dim, and the shadows seemed to dance on the walls. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" But there was no response. I shrugged it off and went back to the kitchen to finish making my hot chocolate. Just as I was about to pour the milk into my mug, I heard another thud, louder this time. My heart started to race as I slowly made my way back to the hallway. This time I saw a shadow move across the wall. It was quick, like someone darting out of sight. I froze, fear gripping me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, but I could feel a presence, like someone was watching me. I took a deep breath and decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and started to check each room one by one. The living room was empty, and so were the dining room and the study. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a faint whisper. "Come here." I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood turning to ice. The whisper had come from my parents' bedroom. I gathered my courage and slowly pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the room. The room was empty, but the window was open, letting in a cold breeze. I walked over to close it when I saw something that made my heart stop. In the reflection of the window, I saw a dark figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I closed the window and backed out of the room. I ran downstairs and locked myself in the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I called my parents, trying to keep my voice steady. They told me to stay put, and that they would be home soon. I waited in the bathroom, listening for any more sounds. After what felt like an eternity, my parents finally arrived. They searched the house but found nothing unusual. They tried to reassure me that it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had seen. From that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house with me. I would see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, and hear whispers in the dead of night. I never felt safe alone in that house again. It was a quiet Sunday evening, and I was home alone. My parents were out for the night, and I had the house to myself. I decided to take advantage of the solitude and watch a horror movie. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and some snacks, ready for a night of scares. Halfway through the movie, I heard a soft tapping sound. At first, I thought it was part of the movie, but then I realized it was coming from the window behind me. I paused the movie and turned around, but the window was dark. I dismissed it as the wind and resumed watching. A few minutes later, the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. I muted the TV and listened. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. My heart began to race as I slowly approached the window. Peering through the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness. The streetlight outside cast eerie shadows, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could be causing the noise. I took a deep breath and opened the window, sticking my head out to look around. The night was still and silent, and there was no one in sight. I closed the window and locked it, feeling a bit foolish for getting so worked up. I returned to the couch, but my nerves were on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to get back into the movie, but the tapping started again, louder and more urgent. I jumped up and ran to the window, but this time I didn't see anything. Frustrated and scared, I closed the curtains and turned off the TV. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would calm my nerves. As I lay in bed, the tapping started again, this time at my bedroom window. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly got up and approached the window. The tapping was louder now, almost like a knock. I pulled back the curtains, and my blood ran cold. There, on the other side of the window, was a pale face with hollow eyes staring back at me. I screamed and stumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I ran to my parents' room and locked the door behind me, my heart racing. I called them, but they were too far away to come home immediately. They assured me it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had seen. I spent the rest of the night huddled in their room, too scared to sleep. The tapping continued sporadically, but I didn't dare go back to my room. When my parents finally returned the next morning, they found me pale and exhausted. We checked the house, but there was no sign of anyone. The windows were locked, and there were no footprints outside. My parents tried to reassure me that it was just a bad dream, but I knew better. To this day, I can't explain what I saw that night, but every now and then, when I'm home alone, I hear that same tapping sound, and I remember the hollow eyes staring back at me through the window. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening. My roommates had all gone out for the night, leaving me to enjoy some rare alone time in our old creaky house. I had just settled down with a good book and a cup of hot chocolate when I heard it, a soft rhythmic creaking coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. It was an old building, after all, but the creaking continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like someone was walking around in one of the upstairs bedrooms. I put my book down and listened carefully. The creaking stopped for a moment, then resumed, this time accompanied by a faint whispering. My heart started a race. I knew I was the only one home. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and made my way upstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, the creaking stopped abruptly. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the window. I crept towards the source of the noise. which seemed to be coming from my roommate's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and flicked on the light. The room was empty, but the window was wide open. A cold breeze blew in, rustling the curtains. I stepped inside and closed the window, feeling a sense of unease. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A small, dusty footprint on the floor. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been in the house. I quickly checked the other rooms, but they were all empty. Trying to calm myself, I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe the footprint had been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed it before. I went back downstairs and locked all the doors and windows. As I settled back into my chair, the creaking started again. This time, it was louder, and it sounded like it was right above me. I looked up at the ceiling, my heart pounding. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "Help me!" I froze. The voice was coming from the attic. I didn't even know our house had an attic. Gripping the candlestick tightly, I found the attic hatch and pulled it down. A rickety ladder unfolded, leading up into darkness. Summoning all of my courage, I climbed up the ladder and peered into the attic. The air was cold and musty, and I could barely see anything in the dim light. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure huddled in the corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. I climbed up into the attic, inching closer. The figure was a young girl, her clothes tattered and dirty. She looked up at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Please help me," she whispered. I reached out to her, but before I could touch her, she vanished. I blinked, unsure if what I had seen was real. The attic was empty. I scrambled back down the ladder and slammed the hatch shut. I didn't sleep at all that night. When my roommates returned the next morning, I told them what had happened. They were skeptical, but when I showed them the footprint and the open attic hatch, they started to believe me. We did some research and found out that a young girl had gone missing in the house many years ago. Her body was never found. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was her ghost or just a figment of my imagination. But every now and then, when the house is quiet, I still hear the creaking floorboards and the faint whispers, begging for help. It was a typical Friday night, and I was home alone, looking forward to a quiet evening. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me in charge of the house. I settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and a horror movie marathon queued up on Netflix. The flickering images and the eerie music made the room feel colder, but I brushed it off as just the effect of the movie. Around midnight, I decided to make some tea to calm my nerves. The kitchen was dark, except for the dim light from the street lamp outside. As I waited for the kettle to boil, I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the TV, but then I realized it was too consistent, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I turned off the stove and stood still, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound was coming from the front door. My heart started pounding in my chest as I walked slowly towards it. Who could be knocking at this hour? I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. The porch light was off, leaving everything in darkness. I hesitated, then decided to crack open the door just enough to look outside. The night air was cool and still, but there was no one there. Just as I was about to close the door, I noticed a small piece of paper on the welcome mat. I picked it up and read the hastily scrawled message. "Let me in." Chills ran down my spine. I looked around, but the street was empty. I quickly shut the door, locked it, and double-checked all the windows. Trying to shake off the unease, I returned to the kitchen and made my tea. I took the cup back to the living room, but my nerves were too rattled to focus on the movie. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a loud bang. My heart leapt into my throat as I looked around, disoriented. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds. The house was silent, but the sense of unease was stronger than ever. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. I cursed under my breath and fumbled for my phone. using the flashlight to navigate through the dark. I made my way to the fuse box in the basement, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty house. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a low, raspy whisper, "Let me in." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was coming from somewhere behind me. Slowly, I turned around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam landed on a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I screamed and stumbled backwards, hitting the fuse box hard. The lights flickered back on, and the eyes vanished. Breathing heavily, I rushed back upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom. I called my parents, but they were too far away to help. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, listening for any more sounds. The next morning, I found another note slipped under the front door. It simply read, "See you soon." I never found out who or what was trying to get into my house that night, but I still get chills every time I think about it.